Picture a perfectly normal spring afternoon. It's May 9th, 2002, in the small Hungarian town of Mor. It's the middle of the workday. People are rushing about their business, walking right past the local Erste Bank branch, noticing that customers are being turned away due to a supposed technical issue. No one panics, no one calls the cops. From the street, the building looks completely ordinary, just a bank that temporarily closed its doors. The people outside have absolutely no idea that right at that very second, just a few feet away, the most brazen robbery in the country's history is unfolding. 2 attackers, 25 minutes of pure terror, and 8 lives destroyed. And for what? For a haul that, at the time, was worth a mere $28,000. But the most chilling part of this story isn't just the unprecedented cruelty for such a small payout. It's a story about a justice system so desperate for answers that it completely ignored a DNA mismatch, a total lack of fingerprints, and basic common sense. The public pressure was so intense that an entirely different man was eventually handed a life sentence for this crime. So how did the truth finally come out? Years later, this case would be turned completely upside down, and it wasn't because of a sudden confession or some secret recording. The truth was literally dug out of the ground by a random guy with a metal detector who stumbled upon a buried cache of crucial evidence. Today we're diving deep into one of the darkest and most twisted cases in Hungarian history. We'll track exactly how a false accusation was built, and we'll find out how rusted clues buried in the dirt finally led to the real perpetrators. Brace yourselves, because this story proves one terrifying thing. Sometimes the justice system's absolute certainty can be a catastrophic mistake. Stay tuned, like, subscribe, and tap the bell. Around noon on May 9th, 2002, the small Erste Bank branch at 23 Dosagurgi Street in Mor was still open for business. Then 2 armed men walked in. One fired at the guard, covered the camera lens, and stayed near the entrance. At almost the same moment, a visitor arrived and got close enough to hand him a document. The second man moved deeper into the branch. From the street, the building did not immediately look like the scene of a mass killing. It looked like a bank that had temporarily stopped letting people inside. The man at the door turned arriving customers away by claiming there was a technical problem. The security system did not record continuously. Usable images depended on an alarm, but no effective alarm was triggered, and the lens had been painted over, so the attackers were not leaving behind a complete recording that investigators could later replay. They were creating the gap in real time while the man at the entrance decided what people outside would see, what they would hear, and how long they could preserve the ordinary appearance of a temporarily closed branch. They stayed inside for roughly 20 to 25 minutes and left with exactly 7,356,481 forints, a haul worth about $28,000 at the time. In less than half an hour, the attack would claim 8 lives. The country would begin hunting for faces, and the wrong man would eventually be sentenced to life in prison for the Mor massacre. Years later, the case would be broken open, not by a confession or a hidden recording, but by objects buried in the ground. To understand how that could happen, we have to follow the case the state built first, and the evidence it learned to look past. The security guard, Sepp Chaba, was attacked first. From roughly 6 meters away, the man at the entrance shot him twice in the chest. The second attacker also fired at him. That second man then went from room to room and shot the 7 people inside. 6 died in the branch. Sepp Chaba, branch manager Schmidt Ferencne, bank employees Josa Ildiko and Baka Lajosne, insurance agent Kis Tibor, and customer Suks Zoltan. Shuk Zoltan's wife, Bakach Gyongyi, died in the hospital later that day. Relief cashier Hegi Eva survived several operations but died on May 16th. That brought the death toll to 8. Early reports of 6 or 7 deaths were not conflicting final accounts. They reflected different moments, while doctors were still fighting to save 2 lives. Later in the investigation, preliminary assumptions would again harden into certainty, with consequences far beyond a changing death toll. Roads were blocked, border checks were intensified, and police called in border guards, hunters, rural wardens, and thermal imaging equipment. Hundreds of tips arrived. Early descriptions of the attackers changed, as did the reported amount stolen and the number of victims. On May 17th, Hungary observed a national day of mourning. Thousands gathered near Moor's Capuchin Church, and white roses covered the steps. The roses became the enduring image of the town's grief. At the same time, every hour without identified suspects made the country more willing to accept the first names that seemed to fit. This was an extraordinary crime in a small city, committed in daylight, followed by an escape that initially left almost no trail. The police had to act quickly, and the public demanded movement it could recognize. A roadblock was visible, a raid was visible, a face on television was visible. The slow work of eliminating a possibility was not. That imbalance did not predetermine a wrongful case, and urgency did not require a lower standard of proof, but it created the setting in which an early suspicion could become a public fact before the evidence had earned that status. The first faces attached to the massacre were not the men who would later stand at the center of the final case. Police and the press linked Robert Farkas and Szilard Horváth to broad descriptions and to their existing criminal reputations. Horváth did something that did not fit the image of a fugitive mass killer. Accompanied by a lawyer and a television journalist, he came forward voluntarily. His alibi was checked, and no material connection to the bank emerged. Years later, a court found that police statements had damaged his reputation and awarded him 500,000 forints, plus interest, roughly $2,500 at the time. The first public solution had lasted long enough to harm someone before it disappeared. 5 days after the attack, police announced that they had DNA profiles from both perpetrators. The promise was unusually clear. Once suspects were found, the profiles would establish who had been in the bank and who had fired. Those words created a test the investigation would later retreat from. DNA had not been introduced as one modest clue among many. It had been presented as the instrument that would make the answer unambiguous. On July 22nd, police arrested Ede Kaiser and Laszlo Hajdu. 2 days later, they were placed in pretrial detention. The crucial lead came from Attila Kiglitz, an informant who knew both men through other crimes and had legal interests of his own. His information was not pure invention. It came from a real criminal world in which Kaiser and Hajdu had real histories. That made it seem plausible that what he knew about them also applied to Moore. Kiglitz would eventually receive the promised reward, 25 million forints, worth roughly $95,000 at the time. Yet his lead did not point to the men who had committed the bank massacre. Then the comparison police had promised came back. Neither Kaiser nor Hajdu matched the DNA profiles from the bank. 5 days after the massacre, those profiles had been described as traces from both attackers, and as the test that would eventually settle the question of identity. Now the test pointed away from the men under arrest. Investigators did not abandon the theory. Instead, they narrowed what the DNA was allowed to mean and kept building the case around the new suspects. Soon, every other form of physical evidence from the bank pointed the same way. No matching fingerprints, no matching shoe prints, none of the massacre weapons, and no fingerprints from Kaiser on the door. The absence of physical evidence was most striking exactly where the accusation placed the two men. No fingerprint or shoe print tied either of them to the rooms. The massacre weapons were not found with them. And the doorway, the position assigned to Kaiser, held none of his fingerprints, even though the theory required him to handle it repeatedly. The question was no longer whether one perfect clue was missing. It was why every test of the prosecution's reconstruction came up empty, while the case shifted more of its weight onto eyewitness memory and an informant's interpretation. The most powerful human evidence did not come from someone who had glanced across a street. One visitor had approached the armed man at the doorway closely enough to hand him a document. That was a real opportunity to see him. At trial, a key witness said he was roughly 95% certain that Kaiser was that man. To a court and to a public that wanted the blank doorway filled with a face, such confidence could sound almost like a measurement. It was not meaningless, but confidence measures how certain a person feels at the time of an identification. Reliability also depends on what happened to the memory before that moment. Photographs of suspects had circulated widely before formal procedures, and some witnesses had been shown images in advance. The defense also pointed to a mismatch in height. Over time, repeated exposure to the same face can make recognition feel more familiar, even when the original memory has not become more accurate. In Moore, confidence appeared to grow, while objective evidence connecting Kaiser to the branch remained absent. The later discovery of other participants would finally prove that the Kaiser identification was wrong. That does not require calling the witness dishonest. It shows something more unsettling. A sincere witness can become more certain while moving farther from the truth. A covert prison recording gave the case a line that sounded like a crack in Hajdu's denial. One fragment was interpreted as an admission of guilt, although the surrounding conversation could have concerned another crime. Police then released a computer-generated reconstruction. One man here, another there, a route through the rooms. The recording gave the theory a voice, and the animation gave it movement. The easier the accusation became to picture, the less attention investigators paid to the physical traces that the reconstruction required inside the bank. Kaiser and Hajdu also had real criminal histories. Kiglitz knew them from that world, and their involvement in other robberies made Moore feel less like a separate accusation that still had to be proved and more like the next expected episode. Once the story placed Kaiser at the doorway, an ambiguous remark, a familiar face, a police pass, or a money transfer all seemed to support the same conclusion. Their later acquittals would clear them in the Moore case, not erase their other convictions. But at this stage, their criminal histories were beginning to substitute for physical evidence, placing them at the scene. Then peripheral details began to be treated as confirmation. News reports said police had found a pass or access document during a search connected to Kaiser and suggested an inside connection through his father's background in law enforcement. Police said the item had nothing to do with Moore. Investigators also spoke of a large money transfer after the attack and Kaiser's familiarity with the town. The money was never tied to the 7,356,481 forints, and knowing the town did not put him inside the bank. Yet each headline made the chosen theory feel less like a hypothesis and more like a complete portrait of the offender. Activity around the case kept producing new headlines. Before Kaiser and Hajdu were arrested, a special unit had already detained another man at a gas station, after which police imposed an information blackout. Later, anonymous sources claimed that Kaiser's weight gain was an attempt to make eyewitness identification more difficult. During questioning, he admitted to another crime but continued to deny any involvement in Moore, undermining part of the police timeline without providing a complete alibi. By August, police had detained 26 people in the broader operation, often for other offenses uncovered along the way. To the public, every raid looked like movement. None moved the investigation closer to the bank door. This was how the case became self-reinforcing. A genuine informant knew genuine criminals. A sincere visitor had seen an armed man at close range. A real prison conversation contained an ambiguous line. A polished reconstruction showed a plausible route. Once the story was framed around Kaiser and Hajdu, uncertainty was usually interpreted in favor of the accusation, while the DNA mismatch, the absence of Kaiser's fingerprints on the doorway, the missing prints and shoe marks, and the missing weapons were treated as separate inconveniences. None of those pieces had to carry the case alone. The story made them reinforce one another. The accusation then changed at its center, while holding on to the same two men. During the proceedings in 2004, Kaiser was portrayed as the man inside the branch with an unknown accomplice, while Hajdu was accused of supplying or concealing weapons. When the case was reopened in 2006, Hajdu was recast as the direct shooter who had allegedly fired at least 47 rounds and killed all 8 victims. This was not a correction to clothing, timing, or the escape route. The identity of the supposed mass killer had changed, yet the same 2 men remained on trial. On December 23, 2004, Kaiser was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for more and other crimes. Hajdu received a 15-year sentence for separate offenses. During closing arguments, the prosecutor had acknowledged that the state did not know who had fired inside the branch, while the man it claimed was stationed at the door stood guard. Yet the Moore judgment gave the public what years of pressure had demanded: a final name, a final sentence, and the appearance of closure. On October 25, 2005, Kaiser's life sentence was upheld. The case was no longer merely a police theory. It was now legally settled, even though the weapons were still missing and the physical evidence pointed away from the men who had been convicted. Yet the life sentence did not make the gap in the physical evidence disappear. Instead, it made stories about hidden evidence more compelling. In the summer of 2002, reports said a victim's cell phone might have captured the attack, and that voice samples had been taken from 17 people. If the camera had failed, perhaps the truth had survived as sound. No authenticated recording ever became part of the public case, and attention moved to a larger question. What kind of motive could explain 8 deaths for a little more than 7 million forints? By July 2002, one answer was already circulating. Citing Blick and unnamed sources, reports described a large banking operation on May 8th, a Slovak money laundering group, a coded phrase translated as Mihali's Day, and hired killers sent to eliminate both people and computer records. The theory gave the violence a scale that the relatively small robbery haul could not explain, and it seemed to fit reports that computer equipment had been deliberately targeted. But no transaction, account, payment, or later evidence ever connected the theory to the men eventually established as the perpetrators. The rumor supplied a motive before the investigation identified the people who had actually entered the bank. 3 years later, 2 prisoners offered another story involving outside organizers. They spoke of other perpetrators, a Russian payment channel, and insurance fraud, while asking for protection, new identities, reduced sentences, or money. The NNI and prosecutors investigated their claims and said they produced no useful new information. The Slovak story and the Russian story sounded related only from a distance. They came from different sources, with different interests, but both flourished because the official case still had no weapons that could confirm or contradict its central claims. Then came a lead that sounded more concrete. In December 2002, an unofficial report suggested that the weapons used in Moore had been pulled from the Danube. Police searched underwater near the M0 bridge and covered more than a hectare of riverbed. By March, the operation had ended without finding the massacre weapons. The case had now cycled through a missing recording, a secret financial plot, and supposedly recovered weapons. None of those leads held up long enough to change the case against the 2 defendants. Each sensational lead promised the one thing the supposedly finished case did not have: sound from inside the bank, a motive large enough to explain the killings, or the weapons themselves. Meanwhile, the DNA still did not match. The identity of the alleged shooter kept changing, and Kaiser remained under a life sentence. Then, more than 4 years after the attack, a man searching for historical artifacts found a buried cache. This time, the headline marked the beginning of a real test, not the end of another rumor. On October 3, 2006, Istvan Shebenyi, an amateur historian and metal detector enthusiast, was searching near Tatabanya and Tarjan. Beneath the ground, he found buried weapon parts, clothing, and other objects. At first, no one knew that the discovery was connected to Moore. It was a collection of dirty, concealed objects whose significance still had to be established. Shabini later said the authorities did not grasp their importance when he first reported the find, and he had to go back to them. The man who changed the case did not identify the killers by name. He put the unanswered question of the missing weapons back into police hands. The objects were seized, and investigators recorded where and how they had been found. They compared the cartridges and weapon parts, examined biological and other trace evidence, and checked the results against evidence from other crimes. The cache began to line up with evidence from the killing of a postman in Veszprém. Each comparison gave the new theory a chance to fail. Instead, the links accumulated. By January 2007, investigators had something the old case had never produced: a physical chain linking hidden weapons to another crime scene, and that scene to new suspects. On January 11, 2007, authorities announced the key connection. Evidence from the recovered weapons linked the Moor massacre to the killing of a postman in Veszprém. Ballistics had done what years of rumor could not. Marks on weapons and cartridge cases linked two crime scenes without relying on reputation or memory. The January announcement did not yet identify both new bank attackers. It gave investigators a concrete path into another case, and that path began yielding suspects, physical traces, and admissions that could be checked against the evidence from the bank. The new trail led to Laszlo Nagy and Robert Weissdorn. For the first time in this story, physical evidence led to names, rather than names leading the theory. Weapons and ballistic evidence tied the pair to the crimes. Weissdorn's fingerprint was found on the bank door, exactly where the old case had failed to place Kaiser. Traces on the buried objects connected Weissdorn to the cache. He made partial admissions describing two participants, while items found in Nagy's possession, together with evidence from the postman investigation, strengthened the broader case. Disputes would remain, but this case was built on a fundamentally different foundation from the one that had sent Kaiser to life in prison. The new names also reopened the timeline. Later records placed their car at a traffic stop for speeding near Moor at about 12:32 p.m. on the day of the massacre. Published accounts do not provide a clear minute-by-minute timeline for the start of the attack, and the original traffic record is not public, so it would be misleading to force the two timestamps into a precise sequence. The encounter itself is the startling part. While police were setting up roadblocks, the men later tied to the bank had already passed through a routine traffic stop. Patrol officers did not have a license plate number or a sufficiently detailed description connecting the car to the branch. They handled an ordinary speeding violation and let the men continue because at that moment they had no reason to see the encounter as anything but routine. Years later, Weissdorn made a darker claim. Nagy had wanted to get out and shoot the officers, and Weissdorn had stopped him. That detail comes only from Weissdorn's later account. The documented irony remains. The two actual perpetrators had been visible before the investigation knew how to recognize them. The final court reconstruction assigned the roles this way. Weissdorn remained at the entrance, while Nagy moved through the inner rooms and killed the other 7 victims. The court linked one of Weissdorn's 2 shots at Szczepchaba to a fatal wound and found that Nagy had also fired at the guard. Because Nagy died before his own trial, his actions were established through physical evidence and the proceedings against the surviving participant, not through a conviction entered against Nagy himself. Weissdorn later tried to minimize his role. He said he thought the gunfire inside was meant only to intimidate people, that he did not know Nagy was killing them, and that his own shots had not been fatal. The courts weighed that account against what he had done, helped plan the crime, entered the bank armed, fired at the guard, painted over the camera lens, controlled the doorway throughout the attack, and left with the money. They rejected his attempt to minimize his responsibility. The available record does not connect every bullet to every wound, but the court concluded that one of Weissdorn's shots contributed to the guard's death. Nagy offered a different version. He said he had remained with the car, while a Serbian criminal called Rado entered the bank, and the name appeared again in his prison writings. investigators never identified a third participant through physical evidence, a message, a travel record, or a witness. The weapons, the fingerprint on the door, the buried objects, and Weisdorn's account all pointed back to two men. Rado therefore remained a name in Nagy's defense, not a third participant independently placed at the scene. One part of the earlier rumors, however, rested on something Nagy had actually done. He entered the computer room, fired at computers, smashed modems, and trampled components. The public record does not reveal exactly which systems were running or what data they held. That uncertainty invited broader theories, perhaps a transaction, perhaps a document, perhaps something beyond the cache. The damaged hardware established what Nagy did. The evidence never established why he did it. The men planned the robbery, entered the bank armed, and left with more than 7 million forints. That explains why they went inside. It does not fully explain why every person was killed or why the equipment was systematically destroyed. Eliminating witnesses is consistent with the court's reconstruction and with the apparent logic of the crime. But Nagy left no verified statement explaining that decision. The case can therefore answer the first question with confidence, but can only circle the second. When did a robbery become a decision to leave no one alive? That question became permanently harder to answer on July 13, 2007, when Nagy died by suicide in pre-trial detention. Authorities reported no evidence of outside involvement, and no suicide note was made public. His shifting account, that he had only been the driver, that Rado had entered the bank, and that a larger motive existed, would never be tested at a full trial. Evidence in Weisdorn's case still established Nagy as the other participant and attributed the killings inside to him, but no more conviction could be entered against a man who died before judgment. Nagy's death also froze the wider criminal picture before every allegation could be tested. Investigators and later reports connected him to the Veszprém postman killing, while information in his diary reportedly helped investigators locate human remains. Some publications put the number of killings attributed to him as high as 13. Because many of those cases never reached a verdict, that number remained an investigative and press attribution rather than a list of convictions. It did show why detectives regarded Nagy as exceptionally dangerous and why his diary became a lead in other investigations. The weapons revealed another disturbing connection. A man identified as Zoltán, who was serving as a police officer at the time, had illegally supplied Nagy with weapons. Prosecutors linked two of the guns used in Mór to that transfer. Yet Zoltán was in custody on another matter when the bank was attacked, and prosecutors ruled him out as a participant. A trial court sentenced him to 7 years for illegal arms dealing in May 2008, and he appealed. The available sources do not show the final outcome. The investigation exposed a corrupt weapon supply line. It did not place a police officer inside the bank. The new chain of physical evidence made the old Mór case impossible to sustain. Hajdu was acquitted of the massacre in 2008. Kaiser was acquitted in 2009, and that result became final on January 18, 2011. Those acquittals applied only to Mór. Both men still had valid sentences for other crimes, and Hajdu continued serving time for those offenses. Kaiser remained imprisoned until June 1, 2020, after spending 18 years in custody. The system had been catastrophically wrong about the bank massacre, without being wrong about every other conviction on their records. The old theory had reached beyond the two defendants. Relatives and acquaintances who supported Kaiser's alibi were themselves prosecuted for giving false testimony. Their statements challenged a case that the authorities had already spent years defending, so the witnesses themselves became another problem for the state to solve. Courts later found that prosecutors had not proved they were lying and acquitted them. Their experience exposes a quieter cost of fixation. Once an official narrative becomes strong enough, people who contradict it may stop being treated as independent sources and begin to look like part of the suspect's defense. Kaiser later sought 25 million forints in damages from the police, prosecutors and courts over the wrongful Moore accusation. On April 1st, 2014, the claim was finally rejected. His remaining convictions meant that his entire 18 years in prison could not be attributed solely to the wrongful Moore judgment, but one kind of harm did not fit neatly into that calculation. He had been publicly identified, tried, and sentenced to life for 8 killings he did not commit, even though another lawful sentence made the lost time impossible to separate and assign a price. Shebeni, whose discovery started the chain that corrected the case, received 5 million forints under the reward offered for the Vesprem postman murder, about $21,000 at the time. He did not receive the 25 million forint reward offered in the Moore case. The published terms of that reward required information that identified or located the perpetrator. Shebeni had found the crucial evidence, but he had not supplied the names or whereabouts of Nagy and Weisdorn. Hungarian courts applied that wording narrowly, and the Constitutional Court did not change the result. News reports said his Strasbourg application was declared inadmissible in 2021. Shebeni's contribution was enormous, but the reward had been written to recognize a different kind of contribution. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Attila Kiglitz, the informant whose testimony had led investigators to Kaiser and Hajdu, received 25 million forints for that information, even though both men were eventually acquitted of the Moore massacre. Shebeni found the buried evidence without which the false case might have survived longer, yet he was denied the larger Moore reward. The courts had already given the legal answer. The offer rewarded information that identified or located a perpetrator, while Shebeni had found physical evidence. The moral answer was harder. The informant satisfied the wording while leading investigators to the wrong man. The finder uncovered the evidence that corrected the case but did not satisfy the wording. The acquittals of Kaiser and Hajdu established who had not committed the Moore massacre. They did not explain how police, prosecutors, and courts had carried the case against the wrong pair all the way to a life sentence. State Secretary Ferenc Kondorossi called for a joint examination of all 3 institutions, including how investigators were selected and trained and how evidence was weighed. National Police Chief Laszlo Bene rejected a special NNI inquiry, saying major cases already received professional review. The next conflict was no longer over the bank door. It was over whether ordinary internal review was enough for an error of this magnitude. One investigator became part of that dispute. Lajos Kovacs argued that the original investigation had committed to a single theory and protected it even as contrary evidence accumulated. After he published a critical book, the NNI did not renew his contract. Kovacs suspected the book was the reason, although no official gave him that explanation. The connection remained his suspicion, but the episode shows how personal the battle over institutional accountability had become. The disagreement persisted years later. In 2017, trial judge Zoltan Varga said he still believed he had convicted one of the participants and had acted correctly, despite Kaiser's final acquittal and without offering new evidence. In 2026, former police spokesman Laszlo Garamvolgi called the public communication surrounding Moore a textbook example of nearly every error that could be made, and reminded listeners that a spokesman delivers the information he is given. One man defended the old judgment. Another described how badly official certainty had been communicated to the country. So the public received corrected verdicts, but no single reconstruction connecting the decisions that had produced the mistake, the promise of conclusive DNA, the contaminated identifications, the changing theory about the shooter, and the repeated decision to treat each missing physical trace in isolation. Bene said routine professional reviews already existed, and he rejected a special NNI inquiry. What never emerged was a shared public account explaining what the institutions had concluded, what changed afterward, and who, if anyone, accepted responsibility for the chain of errors. Without that shared account, questions of responsibility also moved back toward the branch itself. Families asked whether its physical layout had left people more exposed. There was no secured entry vestibule, no bullet-resistant glass, no continuous usable recording, and only one guard. Erste Bank responded that the branch met all applicable requirements and that a sudden armed attack might have defeated additional security measures. The dispute did not shift criminal responsibility away from the attackers, but it raised a practical question the verdicts could not answer. Could different security have delayed entry, provided an earlier warning, or at least preserved better evidence? For two boys, the consequences were not abstract. The massacre took both of their parents, Such Sultan and Bakac Gyongyi. They were initially raised by their grandmother, and later reports described further family losses and financial hardship. The bereaved families did not speak with one voice. 6 families said that the lawyer representing 2 other families was not authorized to speak for them. The loss was shared. The arguments over the bank, compensation, and publicity were not. Erste Bank moved the branch in June 2002 and never again used the massacre site as a banking office. The city created a different kind of permanence there. By the first anniversary, a memorial with 8 symbolic openings stood at the site, and the white roses from the National Day of Mourning had become part of local memory. Suspects and verdicts changed. For more, the number 8 did not. While the town set its memory in stone, Weisdorn continued changing the story he told about himself. In prison, he studied theology, spoke of wanting to become a prison chaplain, and said he had repented. He said 3 of his children had changed their last names. Those details show that his children also carried the consequences of his crime. They do not erase his established role as the man who entered the bank, armed, fired at the guard, and controlled the door. In later interviews, Weisdorn also tried to recast what had happened inside the bank. In 2019 and 2025, he spoke of Nagy searching nervously, possible documents, foreign connections, and something taken in addition to the money. His account offered an explanation for the smashed computers while attributing the unanswered parts of the story to his dead accomplice. But Weisdorn produced no document, client, payment, or independent witness. The pattern remained consistent: minimize what he knew, minimize the fatal consequences of his own shooting, and attribute the darkest intentions to Nagy. His lawyers pursued a separate legal route in Strasbourg. They announced an application to the European Court of Human Rights in 2012. In 2025, they said the court had formally received additional materials in connection with a possible review, roughly 25 years after the attack. Public reporting still identifies no decision on the merits and no confirmed release date, and a Strasbourg proceeding would not automatically result in his release. For now, it remains a legal effort, not a new ending. By 2026, popular culture was preparing to provide the endings that the evidence had not. Director Erik Novak was developing the feature film Volt Egizer Egimor, with financing still incomplete, filming planned for the fall, and a premiere targeted for the 25th anniversary. He said openly that the film would use imagination to fill the gaps and present several possible versions. That is an honest approach to fiction. An actor can give Radu a face, and a scene can decide what was inside the computers. For a documentary account, that is where the boundary begins. On the documented side of that boundary, the central answer is firm: the buried cash, the ballistic evidence, the fingerprint on the door, the traces on the hidden objects, and Weisdorn's admissions established Nagy and Weisdorn as the 2 participants. Weisdorn was an active armed accomplice and was ultimately convicted. The same chain of physical evidence dismantled the more cases against Kaiser and Haidu. They were cleared not because public opinion had changed, but because the evidence led investigators to different men. On the other side are narrower but real questions. Nagy never left a verified explanation of why everyone had to die. A complete public ballistic reconstruction of the shots that struck the guard is unavailable. Rado was never independently identified. No public inventory of the computer room was detailed enough to show what data, if any, were destroyed, and Weisdorn's later claims about documents and foreign connections were never supported by an actual document, a payment, or any other evidence that would turn them into an established explanation. Beyond the crime scene, one institutional gap remains. Police said major cases received professional review, yet no public report has connected the decisions made by police, prosecutors, and courts into a single causal chain. The same uncertainty surrounds the two Strasbourg announcements. Filings may exist, but no published outcome has changed Weisdorn's sentence. These gaps do not justify reviving every rumor. They are the precise places where a new document could still change what can honestly be said. That limit brings the story back to the names that never changed with the theories: Schmidt-Ferencne, Josa Ildiko, Bakala Josne, Hegi Eva, Sepchaba, Kistibor, Suks Zoltan, and Suks Zoltane, born Bakach Gyongi. In Mor, white roses and a memorial with 8 openings tied their memory to that place. The defendants changed, and the judgments were corrected. Those 8 people were still gone. That is why Mor was solved twice. First, the state built a story strong enough to sentence the wrong man to life. Then, a metal detector uncovered evidence that forced a supposedly finished case to be rewritten and led investigators to the actual perpetrators. The second solution corrected the Mor judgments, but it did not bring the victims back, or prove that every institution understood how the first error had occurred. At the bank door, the warning remains. Certainty can look complete long before it is true, and correction can arrive only after the cost of being wrong has become permanent.